On my birthday, my son sent a bottle that nearly stopped a friend's heart. Later, I found my initials beside a dose labeled lethal. I lived small and careful, fixing a porch swing and filing index cards, hoping quiet days could finally belong to me again. He called it love and confusion. His lawyer portrayed me as bitter, and an expert waved away his handwriting while the courtroom learned to doubt me. I refuse to be managed. I will testify, protect my home, and fight clean until the truth stands. Will you stand with me? I'm Frank Dalton, 68, retired, and I still stack my days like I learned in the service. Square edges, clean lines, and an index card beside my coffee. That morning, the card held the date and one word, delivered, because a package arrived with no name and no reason to trust it. I set the box on the kitchen table. Inside was a bottle, deep green label, smooth wax seal, a serial number worth remembering. An envelope taped to the side carried two words in a hand I knew as well as my own. Happy birthday. My son's hand. 3 years of silence. I haven't touched whiskey since the doctor gave my heart new rules. Linda used to pour one out on the swing. I still keep the swing, though she's gone. I slid the bottle away and flipped my card. I wrote Ethan and whiskey because writing steadies what you don't show. A man can accept a gift without drinking it, I told myself. But the bottle felt like a signal. Robert Carson came to mind, my daughter-in-law's father, the sort who brings a ladder before you ask. I decided the bottle deserved a night, just not in my house. The Chevy settled, and I buckled the bottle into the passenger seat the way you secure something that can break more than glass. At Robert's, he opened the door with sawdust on his boots and a working man's smile. I told him it was a birthday gift I couldn't use. He read the label twice, asked if I was sure. I said I was. He set it on a sideboard, poured coffee, and we mentioned the roof he'd helped me fix 2 summers ago. Then I left him with permission to enjoy it, and drove home with the seatbelt crossing an empty cushion. The house met me with the kind of quiet that turns every tick into a sign. I lined my keys in the dish, then wrote delivered to Robert on the card. The phone rang while I rinsed a mug. The number warmed the space behind my ribs. Ethan's voice came smooth and casual, like nothing important ever needs a second try. He wished me happy birthday a beat late, and asked whether I liked the gift. I said it was a nice bottle. He asked if I had opened it yet, and there was a new edge on the word. Yet. I told him I'd given it to Robert because I don't drink anymore. The pause that followed wasn't a dropped call. It was measured air colder than the room. He finally said, "You gave it to Robert," like he wanted the words to mean something else. I said, "Yes." He made a sound that could have been a laugh if it held any warmth, then ended the call without goodbye. I watched the blinds move and told myself he was surprised I had passed it on. But surprise has a quick face, and whatever I heard didn't wear it. I wrote call from Ethan and underlined yet, because the word you underline often tells you what your body already knows. I looked at the empty place where the bottle had sat. I walked to the porch and sat on the swing that has outlived our best summers. I thought about Ethan at 17, grease on his hands, grinning over an engine that finally turned, and tried to connect that boy to the man whose voice had just cooled. The line wouldn't hold. Inside, I added one more note. Keep the door chain on at night, which is what I do anyway. I cleaned the sink, wiped the table, checked the locks. The bottle wasn't mine anymore, but the feeling it left was, and that feeling said, "Be careful," without saying danger. I slid the card under the salt shaker for morning, turned off the light, and stood in the dark kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum. Then I asked myself the small question I'd avoided all day. If my son sends a gift he knows I cannot use, what value does my place still hold in this family? Morning found me at the table, with a fresh index card and a cup I didn't finish, because Linda called from the hospital. Robert had collapsed after dinner. Doctors were checking for a toxin. My hand went cold around a mug I wasn't drinking. I asked what he'd eaten, then what he'd drunk. She said 1 glass of the good whiskey, saving the rest for a real occasion. The floor felt very still. I told her I had a small pour from the same bottle because I'd let Robert taste it before giving him the gift, and I'd kept the rest in a mason jar. I opened the fridge, found the jar behind the milk, then saw a small white vial deep in last night's trash under coffee grounds and lemon peels. I didn't remember putting it there. I didn't open the vial or sniff the jar. I called Gary. Favors travel both ways when you've pulled a friend out of a ditch at midnight. He said meet him after closing and bring everything. No chatter in the wrong place. I drove the 2 lanes slow because speed turns mistakes into facts. The jar riding in a paper bag like a passenger that didn't want conversation. Gary took it without questions in the parking lot, told me to go home and pretend I'd handed him nothing, then disappeared into light that smelled like disinfectant and metal. In the truck, I listened to the engine tick as it cooled until I could tell the ticking and my breathing apart. Back home, I wrote 3 lines on the index card, because writing steadies a circling mind, then locked the back door, checked window latches, and set the chain. Muscle memory the service leaves in your bones. After dark, a number I didn't know rang. Ethan's voicemail said we needed to talk sooner rather than later, and that I should call tonight. I didn't. I replayed yesterday's call and listened for surprise in the pauses. I heard none. I slid my old pocket recorder into my jacket. It weighs less than regret and catches the words people wish they'd said differently. Morning brought Gary's careful voice. Something in the whiskey didn't belong. He was running a second test to make sure the first wasn't lying. My chest tightened in a way the cardiologist would not like. I cleaned the sink and waited. Before noon, Gary called again. White snake root. In the right dose, it stops a heart that already has reasons to stop. I sat down without meaning to and looked at the mason jar and the trash can. The white vial was gone. The bag had been lifted, turned, and put back wrong. No one moves my trash like that. I checked deadbolts and windows. No force, no damage. Worse than a broken lock. It meant someone had a way that looked like permission. I told Gary the vial was gone. He said, tell the police. Evidence only counts when other people can hold it. I went to the hospital first. Sometimes you show up before you report. Linda sat in a plastic chair with her hands folded like she was holding air in place. Robert looked washed pale but stubborn under blinking numbers that kept score with his heartbeat. I said I'd taken a sample to a lab and would put the results in the right hands. He moved the left corner of his mouth the way men who save their smiles breathe. In the hall, a nurse said they were watching for a plant toxin. I thanked her and called the station from the elevator because waiting until I got home felt like letting a door swing open. Detective Reyes answered with a voice that didn't need more words than necessary. I gave my name, my age, and the facts. My son had sent me a bottle, a friend had found white snake root in the same whiskey, and a man I respected lay 1 floor up. Reyes told me to come in that afternoon with the sample, any packaging, and anything that would keep the story from being shaken loose. At home I put the mason jar in a zip bag, then into an old cigar tin, then into a paper bag, because double layers feel like common sense when something has already disappeared once. I added the pocket recorder. At the door, I felt the kind of unease that stands behind you in a quiet room. I took a length of black thread and clear tape from the junk drawer and laid the thread low across the bottom of the door, a simple breach till I learned from a corporal, tired of finding his locker not quite the way he left it. I stepped over the thread and locked up. The station smelled like floor wax and grudging coffee. Reyes met me in a small room with file stacks that looked like a long memory. He took the bag and the tin and the jar with gloved hands and read the serial number like a person reading a plate he wants to remember. I handed him index cards, the recorder, and notes about Ethan's pauses and choice of words. I stuck to facts. He said the state lab would test the liquid and that chain of custody matters more than conviction in the first week. He asked who else had keys to my house. I said no one living, which is true in spirit, and not enough for a man who notices small turns in metal plates. He told me not to speak to my son until he said otherwise, and that if Ethan reached out, I should document, save, and answer with fewer words than a driver uses at a stop sign. He slid me his cell, written in block numbers that looked ready for late hours. Leaving the station felt like stepping from shade into shallow winter sun. I turned toward Ethan's subdivision. Sometimes you ask a question face to face and let silence do its work. His place looked like the rest, only cleaner. His truck in the drive had the shine you pay for when you want folks to see you know how to keep a thing. He opened the door, cycled through 3 faces, then landed on the one he uses when he wants me to think we're fine. Lemon and nothing else filled the air. 3 unopened bottles stood on the counter like a display. A single clean glass by the sink had been dried twice. I asked how he liked the bottle. He said it was meant for me. I said I stopped drinking after the heart attack. Old news. He shrugged. I said Robert enjoyed a pour, most of all the one from the middle shelf with the single malt. He blinked once, then smiled like a man pretending he has a plan. I let the silence sit, because silence is honest when a recorder listens. I told him I never said where I kept the bottle. His eyes went to the floor. He laughed a practiced sound and said, "I get chatty when I'm sentimental." I agreed, because agreement costs less than argument when the point has already landed. I left him to his clean counters. I drove the long way to the hardware store, bought 2 deadbolts and stick-on door alarms that scream without dignity. Back home, the thread was untouched. I installed the back deadbolt first, the place where trouble practices, then the front, and let the alarms scream once. The phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. The voicemail said I was making a mess, and that we could have handled this without outsiders if I'd called back. Handled this slid under my ribs like a burr. I wrote the message exactly on an index card and put it in the fireproof box with a copy from the recorder's micro SD. I slid the box to the back of the hall closet where the floor stays solid. An hour later, a padded envelope hit the porch and set off the cheap alarm. Inside was a phone print of my house from across the street at night, porch light on, swing still. Watched, without seeing eyes. I called Reyes. He sent a uniform to bag the envelope and the photo, asked who knew about the vial. Only Gary. I said the vial was gone. He said they'd canvass for cameras. Even quiet streets have more eyes than they admit. I went back to the hospital with a stack of magazines, because small normal acts tell people you plan to see them tomorrow. Robert pretended to care about an article on chainsaw safety, while Linda watched his face, like she could keep him in the room by looking. My daughter-in-law, Leah, came in with her phone and a tired knot of hair. In the family lounge, I asked if she'd heard from Ethan. She said he wanted to know if I liked the bottle and whether I'd told anyone where I kept it. She said he kept jars on a garage shelf, dried plants, masking tape labels, science a man does when no one is watching. She'd seen his searches for herbal extraction and toxicity, and had thought it was only reading. I asked if she'd talked to the detective. She nodded too fast and said she already had left a message. We went back to Robert and talked weather and the game like civilized people trying not to name other words. I left before shift change. Hallways get crowded with the future then. Dusk made my street unfamiliar. A car idled 2 houses down, long enough for me to notice, then rolled off when I turned my head. Delivery drivers get lost after dark. Sometimes true, sometimes a story. The thread at the door was intact, which comforted me more than it should. I set the alarms and left a kitchen light on. I ate soup standing at the counter like an old habit that completes itself. The phone buzzed with another message. "We need to talk face-to-face today. Don't make this worse than it is." I forwarded it to Reyes, then wrote it down word for word. He told me to bring the jar, the recorder, the cards, everything, and not to meet my son under any condition. I said I'd follow that order like it was written on a wall. I packed the bag with care that felt like ritual, slid the fireproof box back into its corner, like a weight I intend to keep, then stood by the door and listened to the house breathe. Some moments mark the start of a different day. This felt like one of them. Reyes called before breakfast with a voice that carried the weight of a result, and he said the state lab had matched what Gary found, and that the liquid held white snake root in a dose no one would mistake for a spill. So the paper for a warrant was moving toward a judge while we were speaking, and that I should keep my phone close and my doors closed until he told me otherwise. I sat at the table with the index cards spread like a hand I didn't want to play and copied what he said word for word, because accuracy is a kind of respect. You show to facts when feelings want to run the meeting. Then I stood, checked the chain, and took one slow lap through the house with my hands behind my back, like the old days when I walked a perimeter, and tried not to think about how many steps marked off the distance between a bad moment and a worse one. And I stopped in the front hall because the strike plate showed a small, fresh scuff at the lip, where a key not cut quite true can rub just enough to talk back if a man is listening. I did not touch it. I took a close photo with the old phone that never leaves the house and wrote scuff on plate, low right as if labeling the picture could hold the door steady. The kettle clicked, and I left the water where it was because hot water is for making something softer, and nothing inside me felt like it needed that. Reyes came by in plain clothes with a young uniform who introduced himself as Patel, and they photographed the plate and the jam and the small thread I had taped low like a trip line, and Reyes asked whether anyone else might have a key that worked sometimes and fought others, and I said there were no spares hidden and no friends who'd been handed one in the past year. And then I let the rest of the sentence land itself because my son had once had a key, and I could not prove I had ever taken it back. Reyes didn't nod, and he didn't correct me. He said they would dust the odd key they had found at my place if Prince allowed it, and he said this not as a promise, but as a duty, which landed better than comfort. He left me with another reminder not to meet Ethan, not to answer if he arrived, and to let officers be the first voices in any conversation that day. And I agreed, because following a good order is another way to keep a man alive. The warrant cleared just after dawn the next morning, and I learned the exact time because Reyes texted the minute the judge signed and told me they were rolling soon, and that I should not be there under any reason, and that he would update me once the scene was safe. I did not go to the house. I drove 2 blocks past and parked near a little park where a fountain had quit working last summer, and where the benches always feel colder than the air. From there, I could see the top half of Ethan's street without seeing him, and sometimes that half view is enough when you were trained to read what moves without staring. A black sedan and a marked cruiser turned the corner at a pace that said, "Authority without show," and 2 more cars slid in behind, and then the street looked like a place where something official was happening, and neighbors pretended not to count officers by looking away. I watched the team approach the door with the posture of men who are not quite sure who is inside, and I told myself to breathe on a count, because breath is the first thing to speed when the mind writes its own script. They knocked, then waited long enough to prove they were patient, and then used a key Leah had provided, and the door opened on a house I knew only by the way Ethan keeps his surfaces clear and his edges straight. A second team turned toward the garage, and the uniform with a camera began filming his own feet before the first threshold. I couldn't hear anything from where I sat. I could read movement, though, and the movement looked like drawers opening and closing, boxes lifted and set down, and the careful kind of search that pulls slow instead of throwing everything to the floor. I wanted to be the kind of father who left the park then. I did not leave. Reyes stepped outside twice and spoke to someone not in my line of sight, then returned inside with a small evidence kit, and I took that as a sign small details were beginning to matter. 20 minutes later, a tech carried out a clear bag with a glass bottle inside, the label facing the wrong way for me to read, and my hands tightened on the wheel without my permission. Another bag followed with a small spiral notebook and 2 mason jars with masking tape labels that looked like a person's private language. Leah stepped into the doorway for a moment with an officer beside her. Her shoulders were squared like a person who didn't know whether to be relieved or ashamed, and then she went back in. I waited. I watched, pressing my fingers flat against the wheel and lifting them again every time my heart tried to do more work than it had to. After an hour, Reyes finally walked down the street to where the park begins and stood near a trash can, like a man taking a phone call outdoors. And my phone buzzed right then, with his message that they had located several jars labeled with shorthand for root and tincture, and that a notebook with dosage notes and initials had been recovered, and that he would brief me fully at the station once the scene was secured. I sent back a single understood, because writing anything else felt like asking for more than I had earned. At the station, he laid the items out one at a time on a table that had known a lot of people's bad days. He placed the notebook in the center and the jars to the right, and the recovered bottle to the left, and he kept his hands gloved and his voice steady, and I kept my eyes on the notebook like it was a mouth that would speak if I gave it a second. The bottle had the same brand and the same deep green, and the serial number near the base matched the range he had photographed at my place, and I could feel the memory of that wax seal under my thumb, even though it wasn't the same bottle by number. The first jar held dried plant material that looked like shredded straw, until you watched the shape of the leaves, and the tape carried 3 letters that could have stood for anything until someone like Gary could read the language of people who label their harm like a hobby. The second jar held a cloudy amber liquid that clung to the glass as if it didn't want to be moved. The notebook was the kind a teenage boy keeps for gear ratios or a young man uses for job interviews, and the first page bore a date from the spring, then a list of numbers and shapes that meant nothing until Gary spoke low from the phone on speaker. He said the triangle often meant half dose in veterinary shorthand, and the asterisk often meant observe for delay. And he asked for the second page, and I turned it for Reyes and read the initials into the room like confessing a thing you didn't do and can't undo. RCFD. The numbers beside them were not the same, and the number beside my initials made my stomach turn cold in a way even winter wind can't manage. Reyes wrote the date, and the initials and the numbers on his own legal pad without comment, then flipped 3 more pages and found an envelope nested into the spine. He used the tip of a pen to pull it free and slid it into a separate bag, and he told me the outside had my name in Ethan's hand, and the inside carried a single line that he wouldn't read aloud until it was logged, and that his face said more than he meant it to. He added that the labels on the jars mattered, and that the shorthand didn't bury intent so much as it tried to make the writer feel smarter than the people who would read it later. I looked away from the envelope, because there are words that don't help you even when they're true, and sometimes the right thing to do is let them sit where they can't walk around. He told me Leah had consented to a search of shared digital devices and had provided screenshots of search histories that mentioned extraction and toxicity and older men, and that this would help the district attorney believe the story did not need invention to stand up. He said they were still looking for Ethan, as he was not at the house when they arrived and his truck was not in the drive, and that an alert had gone out for a locate that didn't require lights and sirens yet. He told me to go home by a different route and to use my simple measures until he said otherwise, and I said I would, and I meant it in my bones. On the way back, I stopped at the little Veterans Memorial Park and sat on a bench that still felt colder than the air, and I traced with a finger the outline of a name I didn't know cut into a plaque, because names matter when people forget to say them out loud. I remembered Ethan at 10 feeding ducks from bags of bread and asking whether the names meant they finished their mission, and I remembered telling him yes because it felt kind, and because I didn't know how to say that finishing isn't always the same as winning. My phone buzzed, and I almost didn't look, but Reyes's text said a second team had located Ethan near a storage unit he rented 3 towns over, and that he was being brought in without a statement for now, and that someone had tried to trash a box when the units were opened, but that the quick hands got there first. I drove home slower than I had to, because speeding under that news felt like daring joy to notice me. At the door, the thread lay where I left it, and I stepped over it and locked the new deadbolt and set the alarms without letting my eyes close on the way my hands wanted to shake. I made coffee and didn't drink it. I set the fireproof box on the table and laid out the cards, like a man laying tools for a job he wants done well. Then I put everything back again, because there are times when order is the only prayer you know how to say. An hour later, a cruiser pulled up, and Patel walked to the porch with a clipboard and a simple request to collect the photo envelope that had arrived the night before, because chain matters more now that hands were being cuffed. He saw the swing and asked if it always creaked like that, and I told him it sang more in summer when the weight was shared, and he smiled the small, tired smile of a person who has been told enough stories to know which ones are true. He apologized for the questions that were coming and then asked them anyway, and I gave him the times and the dates and the numbers and the names one by one, and he wrote with a block hand that said this would be read by people who never met me. After he left, I opened the hall closet and pulled down the small tin where we kept old spare keys for outbuildings, and inside sat a brass key, cut a hair off center with no label, resting beside two that Linda had labeled front and back in a neat script that still smells like Sunday. I called Reyes and told him, and he said to bag it as I had been shown, and that a tech would come, and that keys are hard to read for prints but not impossible, and that the presence of the wrong key in the right house counts even when a lab shrugs. I hung up and set the tin on the table beside the box, and I felt the anger rise and fall like a hot wind against a solid wall. I kept it there. I let it pass. Reyes called near dusk with an update that felt like a turning point you can name. He said Ethan was booked and had requested a lawyer and had not said a word to investigators beyond confirming his name. He said the storage unit held a small toolkit with plant press boards, glass droppers, and a sealed envelope addressed to me with a single line inside that he would show me later, and that it matched the hand on the birthday card. He said they had located messages to a number saved as RC on Ethan's phone the night before Robert fell ill, and that the number belonged to a burner purchased 2 towns over, and that the content read like instructions someone gives when they want an outcome without having to watch it happen, and that those messages would strengthen the case for intent beyond family drama. I asked him to read one, and he read the words "make the first pour count" and nothing else, and I sat down without planning to, and I stared at the edge of the table until the grain stopped moving. He told me this changed what the district attorney would be willing to file first, and that a hearing would come, and that I should expect calls I would not want to answer. The first call came the next morning, with a number I knew I shouldn't take, and I let it roll to voicemail, and Ethan's voice said that the things they found were not what they seemed, and that I was building a story on old grudges, and that I could still fix it by telling the truth. And I did not return the call. I wrote the words on an index card and slid it into the box with the others, and I held the box lid down for a second longer than needed, because sometimes you feel the need to keep the weight in place. Linda called next from the hospital to say Robert's numbers were better and that he had color in his face again, and I told her the search had yielded more than jars and notes, and that a process was beginning that would move without our permission. And she said thank you in a way that sounded like she knew the cost of the word. I put the phone down and looked out at the street, and a car I didn't recognize moved slow past the house, and then turned at the corner without signaling, and I told myself I had watched too many cars in my life to pretend one more mattered. And then I went back to the table and made another copy of the recorder's files, because redundancy is a form of trust you can control. Reyes asked me to come to the station that afternoon to view copies of the notebook pages under decent light, and to identify any initials or dates that meant something to me beyond what they meant on paper. He set the copies side by side and placed a ruler and a magnifier on the table, like a carpenter laying out tools for a precise cut. And then he stepped back and let me work. I found a spring date that matched the week Ethan had visited after months away, and had left early when a call took him to the garage for too long, and I found a late summer date that meant a barbecue at Robert's, where Leah had walked inside 3 times to answer a phone that did not make her smile, and I found my initials beside a number that made me cold, and I told Reyes I was sure the letters meant what letters always mean when a man is choosing targets and recording tests, like experiments he can repeat. Gary spoke through the phone again and told Reyes the dosage beside my initials was not a test, but an endpoint, and that the entry style matched the kind of notes people keep when they want to reproduce an effect, and that the triangle marks near other initials probably meant he had been testing moderation for taste, not safety. I could feel the room tilt for a second, and then right itself again, the way a porch settles after a heavy footstep. Reyes nodded once and wrote test for taste beside a page, like a teacher correcting a line that was wrong even before anyone saw it. He then placed the envelope on the table and asked if I was ready to see the line inside, and I said I was, and I hoped I was. He slid the paper out with a pen and read the words aloud, because once you begin to say such things, they don't belong to the writer anymore. You'll understand why when it's over. He let the words sit in the air like a bad smell, and then bagged the slip again, and I exhaled a breath I hadn't meant to hold. He said it read like a man who wanted the last word, even if the last word hurt his own mouth, and that the envelope would serve the case, even as it failed the soul. By evening, the local news had it without our names, and neighbors texted Linda and asked whether she needed anything, and she asked for nothing but patience, and I watched the sun go down behind the bare trees and felt the cold come in clean and honest. I checked the locks and the alarms and the thread and the closet where the box sat, and I used that last mention of the old training where it belongs, in a night where the door matters more than talk. I moved the chair to a corner where I could see both doors without turning too much, and I sat with my boots on, and the hall light on, and the phone on the table with Reyes's number on the top line. Around 10, a car idled near the curb, long enough to tempt me to peek, and I did not, and then it rolled on, and then the night settled back into a familiar hum that did not ask for witness. Before dawn, Reyes called with a voice that carried the kind of news that arrives wearing armor, and he said the district attorney would file attempted murder and possession for a controlled toxic substance and tampering with evidence, and that a judge would see him for arraignment before lunch, and that the hearing would be quick and procedural, and that I did not have to be there to feel the shift it would create. He said a deal might be floated by the other side in the coming days, and that I should think now about whether I cared more for quiet or for clean lines, and I told him I cared most for other people's safety and the truth being said in the same room where laws are read, and he said that was useful ground to stand on when the storm begins. I hung up and made coffee and drank this one, and I sat with the mug and watched steam climb into light while the house made little sounds that did not ask for attention, and I thought about the way a verdict can feel like a hard door closing while another door opens on a room you didn't know you'd built, and I wondered what would be left of my son when the facts had finished their work. I did not know. I only knew that the day had arrived when the truth moved out of my kitchen and into a place where people who do not care about me will read it, and that the power in that shift is real, even when it hurts. The phone buzzed at 8 with a text from Leah that she would stand with Linda if the courthouse got loud, and that she had handed over an old laptop of Ethan's with bookmarks no one should have. And I sent back a simple, "I see you because gratitude sometimes reads better as witness than as thanks." Then I set the mug down and wrote one more line on the card, because a man should not lie to himself on a morning like this. Victory will cost something. Which bill arrives first, and who pays it? The arraignment moved like a machine, and by noon Ethan had stood before a judge without meeting my eyes, while the clerk read charges that sounded colder there than in my kitchen. I sat in my truck 2 blocks away, engine off, windows cracked, as the public part of the story began without asking what I wanted. Reyes called with an update and a warning that the next voice might barter quiet for time. He was right. An hour later, a lawyer named Caldwell phoned in a warm tone and said we could spare the family a trial if I accepted this as carelessness, not cruelty. I told him I'd think, hung up, and watched a kid ride past with both hands off the bars, faith balanced by not looking down. At home, the mail held a car lot flyer and a church bulletin still addressed to Linda. I filed both with sympathy cards and walked the perimeter until each lock felt like an answer. Robert called late, sounding more like himself. He'd heard about the deal and said not to take it. A man who keeps dosage notes is not clumsy, he is committed, and next time the bottle won't wear a pretty label. I said I'd carry those words into any room where decisions are made. Good, he said, like handing me a tool I already owned. By morning, Leah texted screenshots. The searches read like a diary. I forwarded everything to Reyes. Moving information to the right hands keeps a story from wandering. Caldwell asked to meet at the station with the DA. Reyes said I could sit in as a listener if I understood the talk would circle exposure and risk. I kept my shoulders square and my voice quiet and let the lawyers test each other's wood. Caldwell offered mishandling and a plea to a lesser count without intent. The DA's tone stayed even. The evidence suggested otherwise. Reyes added nothing. His work sat there in jars, pages, and numbers. Caldwell pivoted to reputation and grudges with practiced grace. Warning trials break families and leave bills. The DA said harm had already broken this family in private, and the public stage is where truth gets its share of light. He floated an expert who would say the birthday note wasn't Ethan's hand. Heat rose behind my ribs, ordinary as a coat. I walked out before listening, turned into arguing, cooled off with a slow block, then drove to Gary's shop. I told him the offer and the handwriting talk. He wiped his hands and said what he'd said before. Notes and jars and matched serials don't care about opinions. I knew the answer. I wanted someone else to say it out loud. He did. A reporter called with a soft approach about older men, toxins, and forgiveness. I said I wasn't a story for strangers and hung up. That night the house popped as old wood does when the day goes cold. I copied the offer on an index card and added a line. Safety first, or it all means nothing. The box closed. My breathing evened like a machine after a surge. 2 days later, the preliminary hearing felt like watching men move furniture while I counted pieces against a list. Reyes testified clean about chain of custody. Gary's report slid beside the state lab's confirmation like parallel tracks. Caldwell objected where he could, raised his voice where it wouldn't help, then tried the handwriting opinion. The judge marked it and reminded him it was opinion, not keystone. The DA had Reyes read one burner message into the record. Make the first pour count because his heart has learned not to move the air around ugly words, he said, voice flat. The room went still, the kind of still that tells you gravity has arrived. Caldwell suggested I resented Ethan over property and past decisions. The DA objected. The judge sustained. The idea hung a beat like smoke from a match that shouldn't have been struck. In the hallway, Caldwell told me I was letting old wounds guide a public hangman's rope. I said rope metaphors don't fit a case built on glass, ink, and numbers, and other people would decide what weight those things carry. He glanced at the door and said there would be more noise before there was quiet. True, even when spoken like a threat. I went to the hospital. Robert watched a bad game, show on mute. Linda knit with a steady rhythm. I said the case had a spine, and the next step asked if we wanted a short path with soft words or a longer path with firm ground. Robert said he could walk a long time with a cane if the path stayed honest. Leah stood in the doorway, unsure whether to enter the room she'd helped build. I told her I saw what she did, and it mattered. Her eyes softened just enough to make the day possible. At home, I let the house be a house and didn't chase every creak. I set the brown paper decanter box beside the photo of my porch from that night. The camera watched without asking. I studied both until they lost the power to lead the conversation, then put them away. Keeping objects in view can be surrender. After 9, Reyes called. The DA was ready to set a trial date unless I wanted to authorize a plea without admitting intent. He'd stand with either choice. His job runs on evidence, not grief. I watched water run clear, then warm, then hot, and said I wanted the truth read where verdicts live. Understood, he said, with the kind of finality you lean on when your legs are unsteady. Neighbors began to wave with questions in their faces. I waved back without answers. Sunday, a churchman asked if I needed rides or meals. I said I needed people to let the system work. Harder than casseroles, he said. The truest line I heard that week. The day after motions began, Caldwell filed for a mistrial, claiming late evidence. The judge denied it with quiet steel and set a date that felt near and impossibly far. I wrote it on a card and slid it under the salt shaker so I'd see it every morning whether I wanted to or not. That night, Ethan called from jail and left a message saying I was choosing sides and there'd be no coming back from public shame. I played it twice, saved it, and didn't answer. Saving is what you do with signals that might matter later. Answering is what you do when you want to believe talk can change physics. The DA put me in a small room for witness prep. Speak facts. Leave adjectives at home. I said I could do that. Facts don't ask for apology. We practiced the rhythm of hard questions and the discipline of short answers until my throat felt rough, and my pulse settled into a pace that could survive a long hour under lights. In the hall, Reyes said Caldwell might offer new stories meant to turn me toward doubt. I said I have doubts like any man, but doubt has to stand next to jars and numbers and see if it still wants to talk. He smiled without showing teeth. That's usually enough. By the elevators, Caldwell said there was still time to choose peace. I said peace that hides truth is quiet with a bill coming due and the doors closed. At home, I set a chair where I could see both doors and turned off the news until my breathing matched the house. I called Robert and said I'd said no to the bargain. Then we walk the longer path, he said. We do. Night settled like a coat, heavier at the shoulders than the sleeves. I lay on the couch and watched the porch light throw a square on the floor and held 3 pictures at once. My son, as a boy, as a man, as a defendant, without letting anyone erase the others. Morning would bring schedules and a court date on a card. Tonight brought the thin question I couldn't put away. When advantage and noise fade, and truth stands by itself, what remains of the bond a father and son once swore would never break? The courtroom felt smaller on the day. Truth became a matter of record, and I sat 2 rows back with my hands quiet, while the judge explained the work ahead, as if each sentence were a tool he intended to place exactly where it belonged. The district attorney spoke in a voice that did not reach for heat, and Caldwell answered with a polish that made the furniture seem newer than it was, and the jurors kept their faces still in that way. People learn when they realize a single look might say more than they intend. I watched Ethan enter with his wrists joined in front and his chin high, and I let the old pictures of him at 9 and 17 pass by without asking to stay, because the room had only one job today, and it wasn't remembering. Closing arguments felt like a tide that had finally chosen a direction, and when the jury left, I could hear my own breath move in and out like a slow metronome I didn't wind. They returned faster than my hope expected and slower than my fear allowed, and the foreman kept his eyes on the judge as if the truth were a line he had rehearsed alone. He read the verdict in a voice that did not bend, and the words landed clean, and the air changed the way air does when a door closes for good. The sentence followed with the weight such numbers carry, 25 years, with no chance to ask for mercy before 15, and the clerk's pen scratched the page, like the world writing itself into the shape it had already chosen. Ethan never looked at me while the numbers were read, not until the bailiff touched his elbow, and then he turned just enough to let me see the set of his mouth and the angle of his eyes, and I understood that some men would rather leave a mark than share a burden. He said nothing the room could hear, and I was grateful for that small restraint, because a last word isn't a gift when it pretends to be a promise. Outside, the courthouse steps held their usual hard light, and I stood there long enough to feel the day begin again without asking me to agree with it. Robert waited near the curb with his cane and the patience of a man who has already done the hardest month of his year, and he touched my shoulder once and told me I did what the day required. I nodded because there are moments when a nod is stronger than a speech, and because no sentence I could shape would hold the weight without spilling. The clerk gave me a manila envelope that belonged to Ethan, a list of small things, and a folded note written in the hand I once taught to sign permission slips, and I slid it into the glove box without reading, because nothing inside that fold could make the next mile of road safer. The weeks after the verdict went quiet in a way that felt almost rude. No sudden calls, no night envelopes, no disguised errands, only the old sounds of a house that had returned to being a house. Robert healed the way stubborn men heal, which is to say one number at a time, and he talked less about whiskey and more about the fence he meant to fix when his hands decided they were ready. Linda's voice lost the tightness it had borrowed from the monitors, and when I visited, she laughed at a joke the TV didn't intend, which is how you know the room has begun to forgive what happened inside it. Gary came by one afternoon with a paper bag that held the small vial I had once trusted him to test, and he said I might want to keep it, not as a trophy, as a reminder. I set it on the shelf beside the glass Robert had used that awful night, and together they looked almost harmless, like props in a picture that would never capture what they meant. I left them there because history deserves a shelf, not a fire, and because forgetting on purpose is only another kind of lie. Reyes stopped after a weekend with fish that had not listened to his plans, and he leaned on the porch rail and told me the lab had traced the extraction help to a cousin on Leah's side, who had more confidence than wisdom and a skill set that belonged in a different story. He said the cousin would answer for his part, but the choice to send that bottle had always been Ethan's, and nothing about that decision could be outsourced. I thanked him without making it sound like relief, and he nodded in the way men nod when a file can finally be closed without apology. I fixed the porch swing when the first real cold settled on the boards, tightening bolts that had learned to complain and sanding a rail that had collected the nicks of years. The chain quit its creak, and the seat remembered the easy arc Linda and I had taught it, and I sat with a mug that held only coffee and watched the light thin through bare branches. On the small table I placed the vial, the glass, and a fresh envelope with the words, "Do not open," written in my hand, and I filled it with copies of every card, every photo, every small proof that had carried me from doubt to evidence to the door of a courtroom that did what it was built to do. I told myself I would decide one day whether to burn the envelope or leave it for someone with a steadier heart, and then I set it aside, because making that choice on a cold afternoon would pretend to be an ending when it was only a gesture. Neighbors took to waving with more certainty again, and the mail returned to its usual mix of bills and polite offers to borrow my attention, and I returned to the habits that keep a man upright when the bigger stories have put themselves away. I wrote the date on an index card each morning and one true sentence beneath it, and I let the cards stack without deciding whether they were a diary or a ledger, because truth doesn't always care how you bind it. Sometimes I wrote, "Slept without fear." Sometimes soup tasted like soup again. On a Tuesday, I admitted a thing I had not wanted to say aloud, that justice had given me the shape of safety, but not the weight of peace, and that peace would not arrive like a package or a verdict. It would be built, small and honest, with choices I could keep and boundaries I would not apologize for. I never sent a letter to Ethan in those first months because I had nothing useful to send, and a letter made of questions isn't a letter. It's a petition no one can answer. Leah called twice to say the house felt different without the jars on the shelf and the notebooks in the drawer, and she said she had started sleeping with the windows cracked even when the air was too cold, because silence sounds less like a trap when a little wind moves through it. I told her that made sense to me, and that Robert's porch swing would be ready for spring without arguing, and she said she might come sit on it when the weather remembered how to be kind. I drove once to the lake, where the fountain had given up for a season, and I sat on the bench that always keeps its chill and watched a father teach a kid to cast into water that didn't want another line. And I kept my face still while a memory tried to take the seat beside me. I let it pass, not because it didn't belong, but because it did, and I wanted it to find its own place without being told where to sit. On the way home, I said a sentence out loud that sounded like a rule I could keep. I said my door is open to truth and change, not to charm and pressure. Saying it once helped. Saying it again the next morning made it real. Winter held on longer than it needed to, the way some arguments do, and then a new light arrived on the street and stayed past 5, and I found myself looking forward to nothing in particular, which is a kind of hope people don't put in poems because it doesn't sell. One afternoon, I brewed coffee, black and simple, and raised the mug toward the yard and the quiet road and the repaired swing, and I thanked what could hear for the grace of clear limits, because limits had saved me and saved others, and would keep saving us if we honored them. I don't know what the years will make of Ethan, or what a hardened number on a paper will do to a man who once took engines apart just to see how order could be rebuilt, and I don't pretend my part of the story can fix his. What I do know sits in my chest with the calm of a clock that has found its pace again. Dignity isn't granted by people who hurt you, and it isn't traded for quiet that comes with a cost. It is kept, one boundary at a time, one honest day at a time, and sometimes with a cup raised on a cold porch to endings that did their job, and to whatever good work comes next.